All right, now we're really getting into the meat of what it means to actually give a prepared speech. This is the stuff that will actually apply to virtually every prepared speech you ever give. Because when you get that assignment, either from a boss or it's your own business that you're working for, or if you're, I don't know, speaking on a book tour or accepting an Academy Award, whatever it is, the speech that you're about to come up with is going to go through this process of first figuring out what the topic and purpose of your speeches are. So when you sit down to plan a speech, what you want to do is begin thinking of them in terms of the kinds of speeches they are, the purposes, and the keys for each one of those purposes. That way, when you're on your own working on some of these speeches, you'll always have that standard in your mind, so that as you're practicing or researching or choosing the right words, you can always say to yourself, am I doing what this speech requires of me? And that's going to make you feel better about the work that you're doing and make you make sure that you're on the right path. So as I mentioned in the last lecture, the first purpose is an informative speech. The minimum for an informative speech is that you have to help the audience understand something that they didn't know before. That's called comprehension. If I teach you something and I use words that you'd never known before, but I immediately fix that and help you understand that word, then I've achieved comprehension. I've achieved the standard of teaching you something you didn't know before. And unfortunately, that's where most informative speakers stop. And they forget that comprehension is just the first step in a really informative speech. They think of it this way: all right, I've got all this data here that needs to be in my audience's heads, so I will spew that data at them and comprehension will occur. Well, even if it does occur, there's no guarantee that they're going to remember it. So truly great informative speaking actually helps the audience to retain the information, meaning not just that they remember it, but they have it at their fingertips, so that when they do need the information, they'll be able to recall it and use it. It's not just that it becomes a trivia note somewhere in the back of their mind, it's that it becomes a piece of information that they can really use. One of the best ways to increase retention is to make the information seem more important to the audience, or make it clear to them why the important information matters. This is called relevance. A great example here is that every now and then a student in class will challenge me about something where they'll say, I don't think that's how they do speeches in the real world. And then I will have to say, hey, that's my fault. I didn't do a good enough job explaining to you why this is the kind of speaking that is actually done in the real world. So to be fair, the first two major speeches that you'll do, the informative and persuasive speeches, are both pretty structured. They're pretty rigid. And some of the speeches that you'll give in the real world won't be that structured. But the reason why is that I want you to know about the structure, because each of the steps is an important stage in doing a good job. Later on, you'll be able to skip those steps, but you'll be doing it because you knew the rules, not because you just missed an issue. So when I make the information more relevant to you, I increase the likelihood that you're going to remember it. A good example of this often happens when students go do internships. If they go out into an ad agency or a radio station and then they come back to their communication classes, they usually notice things and pay more attention to them because of the work that they saw when they were doing their own jobs. So the second major kind of speech is a persuasive speech, meaning that you're going to change the audience's mind, or if they already agree with you, you're going to reinforce their position. That's why we use both the terms alter and reinforce. A good example of this is that if you go to a church service at a place that you've been for a long time, when the pastor gives the speech, you're probably not being changed very much. It's more likely you're being reinforced. Certain ideas are becoming more important to you. It's not new, just stronger. So what are the things that can be persuaded in a person's mind? There are four: beliefs, values, attitudes, and behaviors. We'll start with the hardest. Beliefs are the hardest to change. Beliefs have to do with what a person believes to be true or false about the nature of reality. Now I want to be clear, this doesn't mean what they think is good or bad. That'll be coming later. Here on a Christian campus, this term tends to get confused with morals. Beliefs have to do with things like, is there life after death? Is there life on other planets? Gravity, 2 plus 2 equals 4, stuff like that. If you believe in those key foundational issues, then they might affect your values, but they are not themselves your values. They're just part of it. They're really hard to change. When people believe a certain thing, it's incredibly difficult to change those beliefs. Now, values are a little bit more likely to be changeable, but even then, they're unlikely to go away forever. Values are the big goods and bads in our lives. Things like family, security, community, privacy, freedom. These are all the kinds of things that we want to have in our lives and we value in a very strong way. Health would also be another good example of this. Now, notice that it's pretty unlikely that I would ever convince you that health isn't important. But let's say, for example, in the movie Captain America, we saw the scene where Steve Rogers is tested by a guy who throws a grenade into a group of soldiers, and Captain America jumps on top of the grenade. He clearly values his own health, but in his mind, the value of the other men in the group is more important than his health. So notice that values can come into competition. And when they do, often they still persist. It's not like he suddenly would stop caring about his health afterwards. It's that in that moment, he allowed one to take precedence over the other. A little easier to change are attitudes. In fact, attitudes are so easy to change, they'll often change on their own. A great example of this is if you were to look back at your history on Netflix or Hulu, and you'd probably see that you went through some long stretches where you wanted to watch nothing but comedies. And then, after a while, you might have changed and watched a whole bunch of horror movies, or you might have changed and watched a whole bunch of action. Those are simple attitudes. Your preference for one kind of soda over another is an attitude. Clothing, hairstyles, they're pretty easy to change. And then finally, behaviors. Now, this is the only one of the four that actually exists out in the world, because your belief, your value, your attitude, no matter what they don't really matter when it comes to persuasion until they become real in someone's behavior. Let's say, for example, that a person is really, really overweight and knows that they need to do something about it, but they don't. Notice that their beliefs, values, and attitudes are all lined up. They know that they're overweight, they know they need to fix it, but until they actually take an action, the behavior hasn't been changed. So it's possible to persuade somebody about one or any or all of these, but these are all the things that we can adjust, and we'll focus more on them when we teach the particular unit on persuasion later in the term. Now, the final kind of speech is called an entertaining speech, and the reason I put a little star next to it is that I want to remind you that entertaining is a word that can be a bit misleading because it sounds like it's something that's always good. I gave the example of the Lego movie as being an entertaining speech in the previous notes. It's a fun movie, it's hilarious, but it's also got tearjerker moments. Realize that entertaining is any time that the key focus of your speech is to make the audience feel emotions. So by this standard, a tearjerker movie can be an entertaining speech. A scary movie can be an entertaining speech. So those focuses are all about focusing on someone's emotion. One example given in your book is the commemorative speech, where you're telling us about the emotions that we should be experiencing having to do with a particular thing that happened or we're celebrating. A good example of this that's happening right now is that the movie Goonies was filmed here in Oregon 30 years ago. So they're doing all kinds of events in the different locations where the movie was filmed. They're remembering the fun things and the wonderful quality of the movie that was produced. So what are the focuses of an entertaining speech? Well, the first key is you have to be aware of the occasion. You have to think through what the occasion is and how it would affect the speech. Now, thankfully, I don't think any of those child actors actually have passed away. That does happen sometimes where you have child actors who do not survive into adulthood. But think of how that commemoration of the Goonies movie would change if some of those actors had died. So it would change the nature of the speech. The occasion itself would change and need to be adjusted for it. We also honor the participants. And when we honor them, we basically say, thank you for producing this thing. So whether it's honoring the veterans on Veterans Day or Memorial Day or the movie The Goonies, we're honoring the particular occasion. A good example of this that goes wrong is when people give speeches at weddings. I'm willing to bet that many of you have heard wedding toasts that did not honor anybody, much less the people it should have been honoring. So the focus should always be on the right folks. And when you do focus on them, the focus should be on the kinds of values that you want to really bring out in the audience. So, as I mentioned under the topic of persuasion, there are certain values like security and family. When you give an entertaining speech, you often pull those values back in again. So when someone retires or has a 90th birthday and you want to congratulate them on all the good work they've done, notice that that term good work is probably going to invoke an awful lot of values. So what I presented on the previous slide was basically my assignment to you. I tell you, you have to give a speech that's informative, or persuasive, or is a narrative. What you choose to talk about is your topic. The topic is the subject area. So for each of the speeches that you give, I'll be giving you the purpose assignment, but you'll be coming up with the topic. When you put the purpose and the topic together, you'll have the thesis of your speech. And we really are going to make it as cookie cutter and simplistic as that. Here are 3 examples. Today I hope to inform you. There's an informative speech. Or, today we come together to honor. There's an entertaining speech, specifically a commemorative speech. Or, today I'm going to convince you. There's a persuasive speech. Those are the purposes. Once you fill in the end of those phrases, then you have your topic added and it becomes a thesis. So today I hope to inform you about speech purposes and topics. That's today's speech. Today we come together to honor Steve Martin, who just got an award from the American Film Institute for Lifetime Achievement. In that presentation ceremony, they'll simply talk about the things that he's done and congratulate him on the work that he's produced. So that's an honoring speech. Today I'm going to convince you to start playing brain games. As all of us get older, we're going to need to make sure that we work hard to keep our brains working at the best of their ability, and one of the proven ways to improve your mental acuity is by playing brain games like Sudoku or crossword puzzles. So each one of those would be an example of a purpose, like inform, married to a topic, like speech purposes, to make a thesis. The most common problems that I tend to see when people come up with their topics is they either go too little or too big. Too broad, meaning that they are trying to do way too much in a single speech. Every now and then I'll have a student who will come to me and say they want to give a speech about AIDS. That's huge. There's so much they could talk about, and they've only got 6 minutes to do it in. So you need to focus a little bit more than that. But you have to be careful about focusing too much. Sometimes students who already have an area that they're really interested in might know so much about a topic that they could spend 6 minutes talking about an issue that the rest of us would have no clue about. A good example of this happened with a really fun student of mine that just made a mistake on one speech because he's a huge soccer fan, and he was talking about all of the problems of corruption involved in FIFA, the world organization related to governing soccer. Now, he'd been living and breathing this stuff for years, but most of us in the audience weren't that interested in soccer, or if we were interested, we were interested at a very superficial level. His entire speech just blew past us because he focused so much on individual people that we'd never heard of and organizations that we didn't know much about. So when you pick your topic, make sure you give it to an audience who hasn't heard of it before, but also is small enough that you can give us a brief amount of information in a small amount of time. Another problem is that you might give me too much information in the thesis. Notice that each of those examples presented on this slide are only about 10 words long, and that's plenty. The rest of the speech should be the rest of the speech. Don't give everything away in the thesis. If you want to convince us that we shouldn't drink Mountain Dew, that's it. You've just said a thesis. But a thesis wouldn't be, today I'm going to convince you that you should stop drinking sugary beverages, including Mountain Dew, because of all the different problems that can be caused in your body in terms of things like the yellow dye and high fructose corn syrup and caffeine. What you just did was give us way too much information too early into the speech. Simply tell us you're going to convince us to stop drinking Mountain Dew, and the end of your thesis has been reached. Now, when it comes to picking topics, one of the problems that students have is they're not sure how to handle what I call hot topics. Here's what I mean. It's a pretty broad category, but you'll get the sense that they all relate together. When I say a topic is hot, I mean that it's tricky, and what I mean by tricky is that unless you handle it exactly right, the audience is going to get upset. A good example of this would be something like trying to improve the environment on college campuses to prevent sexual assault. Almost everybody's going to be in agreement on that topic, but if you're not careful about how you word things, you're probably going to upset members of the audience. Divisive topics, on the other hand, are ones where there is very little agreement and you know going in that it's very unlikely you're going to change the audience's mind. An issue like abortion fits here. If you get up and give a persuasive speech on abortion in our class, what's going to happen is roughly half of the audience is going to agree completely with you and not really need your speech, and the other half is going to not listen to your speech at all. That's a pretty common problem on the most divisive issues. Now, not for all audiences speeches basically just means that certain age groups might not be welcome into the speech, or certain members of the audience might not feel very connected to the topic in the first place. I listen to NPR or the BBC on my radio in the car, but I drive my daughter to school. So my 8-year-old occasionally is going to not hear stuff because I have to turn off the radio. Distasteful or gross topics are ones that, for whatever cultural reason, we just don't feel comfortable talking about in public. A great example of this is that any of you who have ever had to talk to a doctor about an embarrassing thing have had to overcome that embarrassment in order to even talk about the topic in the first place. And that's a reason why these speeches can be kind of tricky to give. And then finally, there are topics that can be emotionally sensitive. For example, if you're talking about issues such as race or the death of a loved one, these are topics that are really sensitive and therefore have to be handled very carefully. Now, the problem that I have with many speeches in the hot topic category is they are often chosen by students who are trying to be edgy, and that's why I love the phrase hot topic, because it fits with the edgy theme of the store in the mall that makes students feel as though they're being so rebellious. Well, you're not really being rebellious. That's not the point of giving a public speech. When you're trying to reach an audience, you're actually trying to do the opposite of what clothing stores like Hot Topic do. Hot Topic make you feel different and makes you feel disconnected and rebellious, like I don't need your ideas, man. That's not what a speech should be. When these speeches are done right, they're not edgy at all. In fact, a really good speech on abortion is probably exactly what the world needs. A really good speech on sex education is probably exactly what the world needs, and that speech wouldn't be edgy at all. It'd be a speech that actually can be listened to by a large number of people without offending them. So if your goal in picking a topic is to surprise or shock members of the audience, you're doing it wrong. You're going the wrong direction. So here's how you should handle the question of hot topics for the first 3 speeches in our class. When it comes for the narrative speech, don't. We don't need it. The only person who's going to see this particular speech is me, and all I'm looking for is how you deliver a speech. And folks, I've been around the block, so you're not going to amaze or surprise or shock me with your speech. And that really shouldn't be your goal anyway. The goal should simply be to tell me a story so that I can hear you talk publicly for at least 2 minutes. So please, don't go for the hot topics in this speech. Now for the informative, feel free to go for hot topics. But when you do, here are some rules. First, you've got to be honest with yourself. Remember, an informative speech is not persuasive. You're not setting out to change our minds. You're just letting us know what the facts are on a particular issue. So if you can't be honest with yourself about where you are on the topic, you're probably not going to be honest with the audience, and honesty is a key standard of an informative speech. Be balanced and disengaged. At the end of your speech, we should almost be unable to tell what your position is on the topic. If you did a good job, you should have simply provided the facts to us and let us make up our own minds. That's what balanced means. It means you present both sides of the issue fairly, and by disengaging, you take your personal views out of it. Finally, make sure you treat the audience with respect on the topic. If you present either side's position as if they're ridiculous, the members of the audience who share that position won't listen to you anymore. Say, for example, if you take anything having to do with Republicans or Democrats and basically poo-poo their ideas, then that audience is going to ignore you because you're not being balanced and you're not paying attention to the audience's needs. At that point, you're not reaching anybody, so what's the point of giving the speech? Now, when you switch to the persuasive speech, you can still do these hot topics. Remember, I'm encouraging you to use the same topic for both your inform and your persuade. But when you do the persuasive speech, you need to respect the audience even more, because the audience is the one you're trying to reach. They're the people who are your target. If your speech assumes that anybody who doesn't agree with you is an idiot, then it's probably unlikely they're going to listen to you because you're going to treat them badly. You have to listen to the reasons why they disagree with you and address that hostility. So for example, if you're trying to persuade the audience that a seatbelt law is a good idea, you can't just say anybody who doesn't want to wear a seatbelt is a conspiracy nut. Then that's going to make them feel stupid, especially if it's not the reason why they don't want to wear a seatbelt. You have to address the real reasons. A really good personal example of this is as a professor at Christian colleges for the past 10 years, I've had a lot of students come to me with questions about faith. Not one of them has come to me saying, yeah, I've been persuaded away from my faith by TV or the internet. In almost every single case, the thing that has driven them away from their faith has been other Christians who made them feel bad about themselves. So, for example, when they would hear news about the Westboro Baptist Church and be afraid that other people are going to assume that they also believe hateful things, that's what drove the people away. So, if I'm going to give a speech to a Christian audience about why some students are leaving the faith, I would have to address those real reasons and not try to throw them in a different direction. That's the way to be persuasive, is to address the real reasons why the audience is changing their mind. So here's some ideas about how to approach that in the future.